My Brother's Keeper by James W. Alexander. Preface. Am I my brother's keeper? These words have become the mark of Cain for thousands of years since they were first uttered. He has been set forth from the beginning as the preeminent example of ungodliness in brotherly relations. James W. Alexander, 1804 to 1859, was the firstborn son of Archibald and Janetta Alexander. This book is clear proof that he took seriously his position in the family. Each of the 21 chapters in this book is a letter that was originally written and sent to his youngest brother. It is crystal clear that Alexander embraced his role to be his brother's keeper, and hence the title of this volume. J. W. Alexander was a brilliant man who loved his Lord and devoted his life in the spirit of Ezra, of whom we are told, quote, "For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to practice it, and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel." End quote. Ezra chapter 7 verse 10. Study, practice, teach. This is the open secret of the usefulness of this man. This is the open secret for usefulness of all mankind. This book was first published in 1838 by the American Sunday School Union, an organization supported by Alexander throughout his entire ministry. It was intended to reach down to young men at an age before their habits were already fully formed. It is filled with page after page of sage advice appropriate for those 10 years old and above. No one who cares about eternity will read this in vain. Ever since this publisher was privileged to bring back into print Thoughts for Young Men by J.C. Ryle in 1990, he has searched for another volume to rival and supplement that brilliant book. This is, at long last, that volume. May the Lord of the harvest use this book to rescue many young men from the precipice of a Christless eternity. Soli Deo Gloria, the publisher, Christmas 2004. Letter number 1. Reading the Scriptures. My dear brother, you gave me much gratification when you informed me that you were attentive to the reading of the Scriptures, and I rejoice to find you inquiring how you may continue to read them with greater profit. I shall answer your questions, and shall also from time to time write you some directions on other things, such as your learning, your manners, and your amusements. I take your questions as you ask them. Number 1. Ought I to read the Bible in regular order? I think you ought. Not that this should be the only way of reading, but every day you should be going forward. Suppose you were roaming through a beautiful estate, such as the place on the Delaware where Joseph Bonaparte resides, and that your object was to learn all about it. You might pursue 2 methods. First, you might set out at one of the gates and follow the first path, then strike off into a grove and walk a few steps, then branch into a garden, then return to the fish pond or the statue. You might spend a day or 2 in this employment, and at the end of it you would have seen a great many beautiful things. But while you had looked at some of these 4 or 5 times over, there would be a great number of spots which you had not seen at all. Instead of looking 10 times at the observatory, you might have looked at 10 different scenes. What was the matter? I will tell you. You did not view it in regular order. You had no plan. So you might spend years in reading the Scriptures, and at the end of them you would have learned many whole chapters or even books of the Bible, yet there might be some very useful parts which you would know nothing about. Why? Because you did not read in regular order. Secondly, you might get an exact plan of Bonaparte's grounds, like a little map on a piece of paper. Then you might divide it off into portions and say, quote, I can do so much today and so much tomorrow, etc. End quote. Then you might go over every step of the fine park and gardens, look at every bridge, and examine every curiosity. You would have surveyed every single beauty, but what makes the difference between these methods? You viewed it a second time in regular order. Thus, too, you ought to read the Scriptures. And if you lay down a plan and take care to observe it, and keep it up for a few years, you will know something about the whole Bible. Why? Because you read it in regular order. Number 2. Ought I to commit verses to memory? Most certainly you ought. At least a half a dozen every day. The more you learn by rote, the more you will be able to learn. If you get 6 verses every morning for 1 year, you will have learned more than 1,000 verses or more than 60 chapters. But this is not all. At the end of the year, it will be easy for you to commit 20 verses to memory, as it is now for you to commit half a dozen. The best plan I know of is to learn your verses partially just before you prepare to go to bed. Think of them as you are falling asleep. Repeat them as you wake the next morning, and after your morning devotions, learn them perfectly. This you will find, when you go further in your Latin, was the advice of the ancients, and if you lay to heart what you learn, it will be the greatest treasure. Nobody can rob you of it. You may be shipwrecked, or robbed, or imprisoned, but no one can take this out of your memory. Number 3. Ought I to read the Bible for amusement? Not exactly. If you mean reading it with a thoughtless, careless mind, certainly not. But if you mean reading its beautiful narratives and its lively descriptions because you admire them, and because it refreshes and delights you, certainly it is right for you to read it thus. I have just been reading again the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, and I find it more charming than anything I ever saw in any history or romance. Now, there is no harm in your going to the Bible for pleasure, rather than to any other book. It is remarkable that more persons do not find out how much interesting history the Scriptures contain. Just think of the life of David. It is far more striking than that of Peter the Great or Baron Trenck. Yet scarcely anyone opens the Bible to find rational entertainment. So I have answered your questions, and now I shall add a few remarks of my own. There are 2 books in the Bible which are exceedingly interesting and useful. One was written in poetry, the other in prose. The greater part of one was composed by a great king, the greater part of the other by his son, another great king. One was by a warrior, a musician, and a poet. The other was by the wisest monarch who ever lived. In these 2 books you will find directions for your devotions and your conduct. The Psalms are noble pieces of prayer, thanksgiving, and praise. The Proverbs are short sayings, every one of which is full of meaning and rich with wisdom. When you are older, I would recommend to you to read each of these books through once a month. The book of Psalms is already divided into portions, for every morning and evening in the book I gave you, and the book of Proverbs has just as many chapters as there are days in the long months, one for every day. Scarcely any day will pass in which you will not find an opportunity to govern your speech or your behavior by some of these short maxims. And as the Lord Jesus Christ is the great subject of many psalms, you will learn from the New Testament how to find him everywhere in your daily reading. Farewell, my dear boy. Attend to your studies and your health, and above all, offer up your heart to God. I am your affectionate brother, James. Letter number 2. Gratitude to Parents. My dear brother, I wrote you on this subject thus early in my course of letters because I think gratitude to parents is the foundation of a great many virtues, and one of the first and most distressing symptoms of a decline from the paths of virtue is the unkind or contemptuous treatment of parents. The first commandment with promise is the command to honor our parents, and our earliest duties are those which we have to render to our father and mother. You will find counsels on this subject scattered throughout my letters, but as young people are apt to be impressed by narrative, I will give you a little history, which I am sure you will find interesting. The story is connected with the beautiful engraving on the cover of these letters. There lived 2 poor men in a very rough and mountainous country where they kept their flocks and cultivated such little spots of earth as they could find among the rocks and crags. It was a region abounding in rapid streams, which poured in torrents from the precipices. There was scarcely any point from which you might not see the tops of mountains covered with snow. The hills were so rough that it was difficult and dangerous to travel even a mile from one hamlet to another. Carriages were almost unknown, and most of the inhabitants traveled on foot and carried their goods upon mules or donkeys. Ulrich and Godfrey, the 2 men I have spoken of, had large families, and in each of these was a little boy about 11 years of age. These boys often played together, but they were exceedingly unlike in temper. Little Ulrich was sullen and rude, while his playmate Godfrey was kind and gentle. Ulrich's mother found it very hard to manage the stubborn little boy. He was undutiful and unkind, and gave his parents many hours of anxiety. Sometimes when he was sent to look for the cattle which strayed in the mountains, he would go to some of his neighbors' houses and stay several days, while his mother would be in the greatest alarm lest some accident had befallen him. The ungrateful boy seemed never to think of what might be the cares of his parents. He did not reflect on the hours and days and months of solitude which his poor mother had felt on this account, how she had watched by his pillow when he slept, and nursed him when he was sick, and provided his food, and sat up on many long nights to make or mend his clothes. Forgetful of all this, Ulrich would be sulky and sour when she spoke to him, and would even reproach her in the harshest and most inappropriate language. Little Godfrey was just the reverse of all this. He loved his parents most tenderly, and delighted to obey them in every particular. Consequently, he was far happier himself, and made all around him happy. One afternoon, Ulrich's mother had directed him to do some little piece of work which was not quite agreeable to him, and the bad boy, as usual, flew into a passion and called his mother several hard names. The poor woman wept as if she would break her heart, but this only made him rage more furiously. At last, giving his mother a look more like that of a wild beast than of a son, he dashed out of the house, muttering to himself that he would never return again. This was as foolish as it was wicked, for the silly child had no place where he could live for any length of time, and he might have known that his father, whose temper was as violent as his own, and who was often in drink, would soon drag him back home, besides chastening him. But people in a passion seldom stop to consider, and Ulrich hastened away, and began to ascend one of the steep mountain paths. As he advanced, his mind was drawn away by degrees to other thoughts. At one moment he would pause to examine the scanty flowers which peeped out from among the rocks. At another he would stand and listen to the distant waterfall or the hunter's rifle, and then he would be attracted by the circling flight of the alpine eagle. Amidst these thoughts his conscience began to whisper to him, "Ulrich, Ulrich, you are a wicked boy. You are breaking the heart of your affectionate mother. Go back, go back."